Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jenn, today, and I am here with the creator of an absolutely fantastic new graphic novel. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, my name is Mattie Lubchansky. I'm a author and illustrator and comics artist living in Queens. The new book is called Boys Weekend. It'll be out on June 6th from Pantheon.
It's great. I love it so much. And before we talk about the book itself, I would love if you could talk a little bit about your career in comics and your journey to this book. And I'm also super interested in how your work for the Nib has maybe influenced your, graphic novel writing. Do you feel like it shaped your experience of writing a longer form piece like this? Or can you talk about how you got here?
Sure. So it's kind of a long and twisty thing. So I wasn't always I didn't become a professional comic artist until I was maybe about 30. I spent a long time working. I went to college for engineering. I was doing that for a while. And I always wanted to do comics, was sort of always like my dream thing. I had always drawn. I was the artist for like my high school newspaper's comic section. And then when I got to college, it was sort of, I wanted to do something more, quote, serious. Because I was under the impression that it wasn't a good career option, which, it might not be. But yeah. And then I spent a lot of time doing comics on the nights and weekends and built enough of a readership and started selling some work. And by the time I was working some other jobs out of engineering, I finally managed to make the transition to working for comics right around the time the Nib launched. And, I think it was always sort of my dream was always to do graphic novels. And I got a little sidetracked. Not sidetracked, I guess that's the wrong word. I guess I got more into doing single page gag strips for a really long time. And in the meantime, I was always sort of working graphic novel pitches and trying to get them off the ground. This is Boys Weekend is maybe the fourth or fifth time I tried to make a graphic novel happen. So it's been a very long time coming. And I think in terms of my work at the Nib, I think what it gave me was really just a really good sense. I mean, it was sort of, comics are really hard, right? And it takes a long time to get good at them. And I think it was just sort of the doing a lot of comics every week for, close to a decade and a half now, sort of, it's got me to a place where I can really competently make comics, and the Nib was just a very sort of great creative environment to be in. Mm-hmm. And in terms of I think it's funny, people will read this book, other cartoonists, and they'll tell me, oh, you can tell that you're a gag artist because every sort of page has that sort of rhythm to it. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of something I'm doing unconsciously at this point, but I think it's actually worked pretty good for the pacing on this particular book, that I could sort of have each page or each spread be sort of a self-contained little vignette.
That's super interesting. And I think that's, because in a way, it allows you to balance the horror and the humor in a real way, and so managing that tension between building up the tension to a horror moment, and then sort of working a joke into to loosen it, or play with that tension. That's a very cool way to approach it. Before we get into horror and influences and all that, could you tell us a little bit about Sammy and the situation that they are in at the outset of this book?
Sure. So this is it's very, 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 very loosely based on an actual real life experience of mine, which was very shortly after I had come out as trans to my best college friends. I was asked to be I was asked to be his best man at his wedding, and this was sort of early on. I came out right after he asked me this. So the events of the book are a little different. This is my friends in real life are my actual friends that I'm still friends with. They are, but between me coming out to my best friend or between, sorry, my friend asking me to be his best man and going on the bachelor party. I did come out to him, and we did talk about what that word would mean, whatever. Like, he was much more compassionate about that in real life. But sort of in the book, the idea is Sammy's been out as trans for a little over a year. Their best friend asks him to be his best man at his wedding, and they go to this sort of like Vegas seasteading thing, bachelor party, where it's sort of like an everything goes Las Vegas floating in international waters.
Mhm. I absolutely the setup is so interesting, and El Campo is so interesting, and I think like oh gosh, what was I gonna say? Like the personal stakes, you know, of
Mhm.
them having to be on this trip where people are not really very sensitive about their transition and their experience in the moment there at that trip, but also like the where they are being so like horrifyingly hyper-capitalistic and just like
Yeah.
really a nightmare. You know, it's like a really nice balance of like personal horror and just like sort of atmospheric horror going on.
Yeah. I mean, that was me sort of like, that's how I feel going to Vegas a little bit. You know, which like certainly people like it. I don't want to say it's like the most evil place on earth, but for me personally, it was sort of the thing I kept describing it as is have you ever read The Dispossessed by
Yeah.
Ursula Le Guin? So it's one of
Mhm.
my very favorite books, by one of my very favorite authors. And so much of that book is describing the experience of experiencing capitalism for the very first time for someone who's never experienced it, and the sort of like the way you truly feel like an alien if you try to describe how our society is put together and how it functions to someone who's never experienced that. It does sound completely insane, right? And that's how I always felt about going to Vegas, was sort of like me experiencing capitalism for the first time. Um, you know, it just felt, it's a very alienating experience for me personally. And I was sort of trying to convey that same feeling, and the idea of this place where anything goes, right? It's all no holds bar. Every pleasure is available to you. But as long as it's within these like sort of strict boundaries of like, I hate saying this, but like cis heteronormativity, right? Like
Mhm.
everything goes as long as you are, as long as you fit into sort of what is like normal. But if you exist outside of that, it's sort of this, that system doesn't really know what to do with you.
Mm. Yeah, and that experience for Sammy is so evocatively portrayed. It's such like a really great subjective inside their head experience of this place. And there is like a real urgency to this idea that like they are in this place where, as you say, anything goes, but when their identity makes that not true for them, like that really that mix of like feeling unfree and having to perform for people who are like supposedly your friends but not being very friendly in the moment, and then also dealing with this like horrible actual place that you're in, you know, like there's a lot of horror there to mine.
Yeah.
um so speaking of horror, could you talk a little bit about your own relationship to horror and like what your influences are? Because I see a lot of folk horror here, and also like social horror, like almost like Get Out in a way and stuff about like microaggressions and how they affect people. Like, so can you talk a little bit about like, yeah, like the horror you like and how it influenced your storytelling here?
Sure. Yeah, it's actually very interesting. I've been I was always thinking a lot about, so I guess we were talking before about like the difference between like horror and humor. There,
Mm.
it's like, I'm the 800th person to say this, but like they are basically the same thing, right? Like you are toying with the same mechanism. It is all about expectation versus what actually happens. You're always trying to surprise people. Um, so the idea that base and I think I think a lot about actually a comic artist I know named Julia Raffair, who's great. We were on a panel a long time ago talking about horror in comics, and she made this great point about how there's so much about with what's so great about comics is that you the reader has to be turning the page, right? So every time there is something happening, they're actually a participant in the tension in a way
Mm.
that it's not always the case in say like a movie or a novel, right? Where you're thinking less about like the page layout when you're writing a novel, because who knows what size the type will be, it'll be paperback, whatever. But in a comic, you have really, really serious control over where the reader's eye is. That's the whole point of it, right? So there's a lot there to toy with. I actually think a lot about like my favorite horror stuff is kind of all over the place. I really love, yeah, like you mentioned folk horror. I really love The Wicker Man a lot. I think a lot about like the sort of like the culty aspects. I was thinking a lot about that movie. Um, let's see. I mean, yeah, I really do like the work of Jordan Peele a lot. I was thinking a lot about Get Out and also Us when I was doing it. A movie I really love. I'm always thinking about I really love Stanley Kubrick. I mean, The Shining's a great movie. I what else in terms of like the people that are really good at like sort of excising like tension from social situations. I really love Robert Eggers' The Witch. It's a really great movie that I was like watching a lot of horror movies when I was working. And it's kind of Midsummer is another movie that I like a lot. Just sort of like movies that take these sort of like just extracting the sort of terror out of an uncomfortable situation instead, making the subtext more text.
Oh, absolutely. And they're all like very good at building dread to this like sort of cathartic moment at the end, cathartic in like good and bad ways.
Yeah. I mean, a movie that is goofy, but I like a lot that actually was weirdly influential in this book was the movie Ready or Not. It's with Samara Weaving, who's not Margot Robbie, but it's very much like this really good Final Girl movie that I had watched right before I started pitching this book. And I just think it's a really good sort of like, it's a social satire, but it's also very like, it is just a Final Girl movie, which is, clearly like the structure of this book is very much based off of those sorts of things. Which like I've, like tons of B movies I can't even name at this point that I've seen that are like that. But that's sort of like, that's the structure I was working within, but I was trying to make it a little more tense than that.
I'd love if you could talk a little bit about, the way in this story that sort of like the hyper-capitalist environment is like intersecting with the abuse, let's say that Sammy is experiencing, and were you thinking about the way that like capitalism and transphobia operate together? Because like I was just thinking while I was reading about the ways in which like, capitalism needs to like codify and classify people in order to put them into groups to be marketed to or to be sold to or sold them, and like how, like, was that something that you were thinking a lot about when you were writing this?
Yeah, that's exactly true. Like, I think it's easy to read this book and think that the criticisms are coming off kind of scattershot of a lot of different things, but it is all to me one big thing, right? And the big monster is capitalism and not necessarily one thing or the other. Like you could do this with capitalism and a lot of other issues that we have, right? And sort of like, and transphobia is one of those things. And I think it's easy these days. People talk a lot about, I think some corporations and things right now have decided that trans people are okay to market to, but that can change any second. And that's only based on what they think they can do to extract profit from people. And I think, what you said is exactly right. Like it's all about it's all about codifying what is there. I think it is an interest of capitalism to have sort of underclasses that can be exploited. And I think right now it's fairly obvious that trans people are one of them. Like, I as a middle class white trans person am fine, but I think it's sort of, it's hard to not notice what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it really hit home for me too, the way that like, this is also a thing that people have said many times before me, but that like we use these like depictions of the near or sometimes distant future, to speak about like a very current moment, and like looking at sort of like what's the word I'm looking for? Like predicting like how our situation is going will exacerbate itself or escalate, can really tell you a lot about the moment that we're in. With that in mind, can you tell us a little bit about like because in this book the word ally is thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
Like there aren't a lot of like real true allies to be found. Like Sammy's partner absolutely is. Sammy's partner is like this sort of like the safe space in this book. Like when like every time she was there, I was like, oh. And but yeah, so can you talk a little bit about like the sort of like the various kinds of microaggressions that these allies show, and the way that it shapes Sammy's experience like of this place? Because, you know, it does erupt into like outright transphobia and direct transphobia sometimes, but a lot of it is just that very under the surface like microaggression-y stuff, and they hit in different ways. So can you kind of talk about the way that like shapes the storytelling here too, if that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. So I think in terms of like, I think it's hard to extract like the idea of a microaggression out from. I think that term has taken on a little bit of life of its own, right? And I think what I was trying to get at is these lots of little things people do that, to me, a trans person, tell them that they basically, they don't give a shit, right? So sorry if I'm allowed to swear. I know it's a library.
I can't, but you can. So
Okay, beautiful. Sorry. So I think it's easy to get caught up in the sort of like, oh, it's all about pronouns and respecting people's whatever. And obviously that's, I don't want people to go around misgendering me, right? But I think when it is happening frequently with people, it is hard to extract that from those people are refusing to fundamentally do the work in their own mind to change their perception of you, right? And I think of it almost like being fluent in a language or something, where you are either like, you are not, if you're sitting there translating every time in your head, I need to be saying X, you are then doing the trans person in your life a favor and not trying to actually think about who they've told you that they are, right? So I think when those things come out, it is because the person on the other side doesn't care enough to really try, right? And I think people just need to have more respect for themselves and not put up with that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's not about like, it's not, people's pronouns are not the be all end all, but I think it is generally indicative of a larger issue on the other end.
That's a really, really good point. And it did remind me of something else I thought while I was reading, which is that in a way, yeah, like the friends that Sammy is there with, Adam and his friends in the bachelor party, like his friends are a lot more outright insulting, I would say. But and Adam definitely sees himself as like a good guy and an ally, and he I think calls himself that too, right? If I'm not like mistaken.
I'm not sure if he uses that word, but he definitely
But
sees himself as
definitely,
as
yeah,
one of the good guys. Yeah.
But in a way that makes him a little bit more dangerous even, because like the outright person can be at least predicted to some extent, and
That's right.
the person who won't stand up for you, like that's a little bit more insidious, and so yeah, can you talk about this and how it all relates to masculinity? Because I think there's a lot that this book has to say about like masculinity and how it perhaps presents or is shaped in very toxic manners, and how sort of like that's at play not only in like the friend group but in like the cult at the center of this story. Like, is that something that you could talk a little bit about without like spoiling too much?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the sort of thing where I think in the book there's a lot of bad examples of how men can be, but there's also one of the main characters that sort of like, as you refer to, as sort of like a safer space from Sammy, is like a good friend of his, or a good friend of a good friend back home, who he's like a man who is good to Sammy, Cal, but like I think sort of like, what am I getting at here? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. The idea of masculinity as a sort of cult is not necessarily true for all men, right? But it's sort of, on some level, it is a place that you can easily get trapped in these sort of, it's more performance, right? It's more expectations from society, from capitalism, from whatever you want to call it. And you can either join in and be part of the problem, or you can, do something else. You can be a different way. I think I'm a little tangled up here. Sorry.
It's hard to talk about. Like I have
Yeah.
before I was here, I did a doctorate in medieval history and masculinity studies, and I looked at like crusader masculinities, and I still really can't talk about it particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, that's a great point, actually, because it's interesting to think about as masculinity being tied to a time and a place and a culture, right? Whereas like masculinity has always looked different throughout human history, right? You know, for the zillionth time, you know, high heels and makeup were invented for men, for, you know, riding horses and looking like you weren't sickly at court. But, you know, I think, but what's important is that it's always the thing that is perceived as dominant, you know, and that's based around how our culture operates, right? Capitalism in this instance. So it's sort of, yeah, you can either be a participant in that culture, but that's a choice you have to make. There's nothing inherent to being a man that makes you have to be like that, right? So I think it's sort of like, it's more of a cultural issue that is a personal choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this book has a lot to say about like the way, again, in which those things like interact, and how, like, you know, yeah, market forces and capitalism will promote certain models of masculinity or any gender construct in order to like make money or market things, you know. And I think that this book like really treats in a very nuanced way like the way in which all these forces kind of collaborate. Could you talk
Yes.
a little bit about, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just saying, yeah, like it's either marketing or, I keep forgetting to mention, just like the consolidation of actual power, right? Outside of money, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But and like with the sort of sly way it does it, you know, because like the thing to me about El Campo too is that like it's presented as this place like, yeah, where like you can go and experience a lot of freedom, but then like other people's freedom in that space will directly like impinges on the freedom of other people in that space, especially if you aren't fitting like that dominant model, you know. And so like
Yeah.
it's, yeah, I absolutely love this book, and you know, I really
Thank you.
appreciate you coming to talk about it. I know it's often difficult for artists to talk about like what is in the works, but is there anything upcoming that you are able to talk about a little bit or hint at?
Yeah, so I mean, this has been announced. I'm working on a new graphic novel right now, for Pantheon again, called, the working title's Simplicity, and it's sort of like, it's another horror book, again about the future, but it's a lot different. It's about sort of like oh, what was the actual log line here? I'm still, you know, it's still in the, I finished the second draft of the script like today. But it's sort of about like a sociologist that goes to talk to a cult that's living in the Catskills in the sort of like ruined former US.
Ooh, well, that sounds very cool. Well, I hope that, you know, you'll consider maybe joining us again to talk about that, because I love talking to you today. This has been really great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
No problem. All right, listeners, please pick up Boys Weekend. By the time that you hear this, it will be available. So please go to your favorite comic book store or independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to get those things. Thank you so much for joining us. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.